Welcome to the 8th South-South Forum on Sustainability. The theme is the politics of hope, people's resilience and resistance in catastrophic times. Today, we have Lecture 4, Tentative Lessons from the Pandemic about the world we live in. The speaker is Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram from Malaysia. We provide English, Chinese, Spanish, English simultaneous interpretation. You can choose the interpretation at the bottom of the computer screen. We would like to thank today's interpreters, Liang Yin and Li Monghong, Henry Cottin and Julieta Mendes. May I first introduce the moderator for today's session. My name is Xue Cui, Margaret Dradi. I am Associate Professor at the Institute of Rural Reconstruction Movement of China in Southwest University, China. I am board member of Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives and one of the founding members of Global University for Sustainability. I have been actively involved in the rural reconstruction movement in China since 2000. Professor Maria Lucia TEIXEIRA is professor and coordinator of the graduate program in social policy at the Federal University of Espírito Santo, Brazil. She is an expert on social work, particularly on social policy and health policy. She was coordinator of social work area of the Scientific Technical Council at the Coordination for the Improvement of Higher Education Personnel of the Ministry of Education in Brazil from 2014 to 2018. Thank you. Please, Professor GARCIA.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for all participants. It's an honor for us to moderate this session today about tentative lessons from the pandemic, about the world we live in, with Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram from Malaysia. In Brazil today, more than 512,000 deaths by COVID-19 as a result of far-right Bolsonaro's government. Start this section. It's an honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Jomo. Professor Jomo is Senior Advisor at Khazanah Research Institute. He's also Fellow of the Academy of Science in Malaysia, Emeritus Professor at the University of Malaya, Visiting Fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Columbia University, and Visiting Professor at the International Islamic University in Malaysia. Jomo was a member of the Economic Action Council, chaired by the 7th Malaysian Prime Minister 2019-2020, and the 5-member Council of Eminent Persons appointed by him, May-August 2018. United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, 2005-2012. Research Coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs and Development, 2006 and 2012. Assistant Director General for Economic and Social Development, Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, of the United Nations, 2012-2014, and third holder of the Tun Hussein Chair in International Studies at the Institute of Strategy and International Studies, Malaysia. He received the 2007 Vasily Leontief Prize for Advancing for the Frontier of Economic Thoughts. John has authored and edited over 100 books and translated 12 volumes, besides writing many academic papers and media articles. He was professor in the Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya, until November 2004. founder director of the Institute of Social Analysis and founder chair of IDEAS, International Development Economics Associated, independent member of the National Economic Consultative Council, president of Malaysian Social Science Association, and founding convener of the International Malaysia Institute Conference. He was also of the board of the United Nations Research Institute of Social Development, Geneva. He is on the editorial board of several learned journals. Welcome, very welcome, Professor Jomo, and it's an honor to listen to your conference.
Thank you very much, Lucia, and thank you also to the Global University for Sustainability for kindly inviting me to be with you today. I have entitled my talk tonight as one of 10 involving tentative lessons. And the main reason, of course, is that we are unfortunately still at the very early stages of what has become a catastrophe. It started off as an epidemic barely a year and a half ago, but now, because of the way it has been mishandled, it has become a major catastrophe, affecting particularly the global south much more than the rest of the world, especially with the beginning of vaccinations more recently. I'm going to try to draw 12 lessons from this pandemic, but I think it is useful to begin with a historical lesson from over a year ago. So because many of those in the audience are from China, I want to, my first lesson from over a century ago is actually something which happened in China. There was a doctor named Dr. Wu Liante, who was actually from my country. In fact, he was from my school, but he managed to win a scholarship to Cambridge, became a medical doctor, and came back to work in my country. And he was very active in the anti-opium movement. But opium, of course, was a very major source of trade and power for the British, but even after the end of the East India Company. And so he was basically not allowed to continue to practice in Malaysia, and for that matter, in anywhere else in the British Empire. So he went to work for the Manchu, the last emperor of China, and at that time there was a plague in Manchuria, and because many people didn't want to go there, he went there, and he basically quickly analyzed the situation and realized that it was a pneumonic plague. A pneumonic plague meaning that it was conveyed by aerosols, by air, rather than a bubonic plague, which would come about through contact with animals, particularly rodents. So when he made this analysis, unfortunately, because he was not considered to be authoritative, not a white man, his analysis was rejected, and instead there was a French specialist at a Chinese military academy nearby, and that French specialist's view was that the Wu was wrong, and therefore there was no need to wear the mask. Now, what we call the N35 mask was actually first developed by Dr. Wu. Anyway, Dr. Wu, the French doctor insisted on his analysis, and Dr. Wu was ignored. And the French doctor arrived in Manchuria, and unfortunately, within a month, he was dead. Only after his death did Dr. Wu's analysis begin to have some influence, and he managed to contain the epidemic. I think this story tells us a lot about the semi-colonial status of the Manchu empire of and it also tells us a lot about racism in science. And this, I think, is very important for us to recognize if we try to understand what has been happening more recently, more than a century later. So my 12 lessons are as follows. One of the unfortunate problems we have is that many people have chosen to portray this catastrophe, this pandemic, as involving a false choice between lives and livelihoods. That it is necessary to have stay-in-shelter lockdowns. Stay-in-shelter lockdowns are considered to be almost the only option for dealing with the pandemic. And I would argue that this has been a false option. If we look at China outside of Wuhan city and the 3 surrounding provinces, because it has to be remembered that for the first month or so in China, people were still struggling to understand the specific characteristics of this epidemic. And so we have to recognize that every epidemic is different. We cannot assume that epidemics are all the same and that we can have a plan to deal with all epidemics, or even an epidemic with certain characteristics which may be different from one epidemic to another. For example, there was a SARS epidemic about slightly under 2 decades ago, but that SARS epidemic was spread by the coronavirus, but a different coronavirus, and that was less infectious but more deadly, and it claimed many victims. So when in dealing with this, we have to recognize its specific characteristics. So this choice between life and livelihoods, unfortunately, has been very problematic, and particularly the insistence on stay-in-shelter lockdowns. Now let us look what happened in China, in Wuhan particularly. Once it was realized the nature of the epidemic, the nature of the virus, and how it was conveyed, and so on and so forth, the Chinese authorities at the national as well as the provincial level immediately had a stay-in-shelter lockdown during the time of the Chinese New Year celebrations at the end of January. But together with that stay-in-shelter lockdown was a number of other measures. And this is very important to remember, because country after country are adopting lockdowns, but they do not do enough in terms of the other efforts. And the result is that they have continued to struggle with the pandemic. And the pandemic is able to be controlled during any lockdown because you're reducing contact among people. But then after that immediate reduction, once you allow normal economic life and social life to resume, it is very likely that the pandemic will resume. But in the case of Wuhan and the surrounding provinces, it's very important for people to realize that Wuhan city, Wuhan has been the industrial capital of China for a century. It's not something which happened recently. And that the people from, although Wuhan is in Hubei province, people from surrounding provinces would travel on a daily basis. They were commuting to work in Wuhan. So it was very easy for the pandemic to spread, the epidemic to spread to the surrounding provinces. So there were stay-in-shelter lockdowns there. And after the situation came under control, it was lifted. But you find that in China, there have been selective, targeted stay-in-shelter lockdowns after that, but never has there been a nationwide stay-in-shelter lockdown. In the case of the Republic of Korea or South Korea, there was never a stay-in-shelter lockdown. Even in Daegu City, where the first infections were detected due to an underground Christian cult which was operating there, even then, there was no stay-in-shelter lockdown, not even in Daegu City. Likewise, we find that in Japan or in Taiwan province of China or in Vietnam, as well as in Laos, as well as in Kerala in Southwest India, there has not been a national level stay in shelter lockdown. This is very important for us to remember, and that even when you have a stay in shelter lockdown, once the situation is out of control, you need to have a stay in shelter lockdown. But in addition, there have always been a number of other measures, which then leads me to the next lesson to be learned, which is the need for all of government approach. You cannot have an approach which is simply a public health approach. You cannot have an approach which is simply a policing approach. And unfortunately, too many governments are just focusing on policing of public health measures to ensure that people conform to those measures and very little else. What you need instead is a very holistic, comprehensive approach. Very early on, the foreign minister of Korea, Han, elaborated what the Korean government was doing, which was very appropriate to the Korean situation. But it's very important to recognize the lessons which can be learned from there, the lessons which can be learned from China, as well as the other countries which I mentioned earlier. So you find that in those places, what you had was a situation where in addition to the public health authorities, in addition to the police, the role of the police and so on and so forth, you also had, for example, the reorganization of workspaces, both in factories as well as in offices, to minimize the likelihood of infection among fellow workers, as well as between workers and customers and clientele and so on and so forth. All this was undertaken very early, and the reorganization of public space, precautionary measures which were taken in public spaces and so on and so forth. And very, very importantly, testing. And this is part of the tragedy of the present situation, where many poor countries unfortunately cannot afford to test because the tests are unfortunately too expensive for them to be able to test on a mass level. And so when a poor country can only afford to selectively test the likelihood of catching all the possible sources of infection are considerably reduced. So this is why, I'll come back to this question later, but it is very important for us to recognize that many of these methods were adopted in relatively wealthier countries like Japan and Korea and so on, but they were not adopted, say, in Vietnam or in Laos or in Kerala. There, much poorer societies, alternative methods were introduced. In Kerala, for example, very early on, as early as February, you find, because there were many students from Kerala and workers from Kerala from Wuhan, and some of them brought back the virus. So what happened was that in Kerala, they required, for example, poor women who had no other means, they couldn't afford to buy masks, they were told how to wrap up parts of old saris in order to tie them up to cover the face and so on and so forth. How many layers to introduce when you wrap a particular sheet of cloth and so on. So in this way, even poor people could afford to protect themselves. They could not buy masks, they could not afford masks, and even when in some societies masks are given free, but instead they found other ways to protect themselves. All this was done through a comprehensive approach. Likewise, various measures were undertaken in schools. So schools, for example, in China, resumed teaching, even in those 3 provinces I mentioned earlier, fairly early on. So the massive disruption, many people focus on the fact that China continued to grow last year. But beyond that, one has to remember that life went on. Students went back to school and so on and so forth. This is very, very important for us to remember. So all of government approach, a holistic approach involving the reorganization, for example, not only of public space, not only of workspaces, but even of public transportation and a whole variety of other things involved, for example, conveying information to the public became very, very important and very, very successful in these societies. Yet another element which I think is very, very crucial is a whole of society approach. A whole of society approach. In other words, you must involve the whole of society. People must understand the challenge they face. If they do not understand the challenge they face, it is very difficult to tell them to conform to certain requirements without them understanding why those requirements are necessary. So this kind of approach is necessary. Initially, in February last year, some of my friends and we started talking about war mobilization. But then we realized that in places like Brazil, for example, the president was using this as an excuse for all kinds of other measures, or for an excuse for repressive measures. So the president of Brazil at one time even called for a coup against his own government, because that was the way, by centralizing power, he could weaken the governors from other political parties, the state governors, in order to have a greater central control. So it is very important to mobilize all of society, and not through just forcing them to do things, but to explain, and they must be educated. In Kerala, for example, every day the chief minister himself and the health minister would explain to the people what the latest situation was, what they were doing, and so on and so forth. So you have this confidence of the public in the government, and this was extremely important. So we have this kind of approach, which was very successful in East Asia as well as in Kerala, but unfortunately nobody was very interested in learning from East Asia. It's a point that I want to emphasize, because the same thing happened about a quarter of a century ago. In 1997, 1998, there was a so-called Asian financial crisis. And the Asian financial crisis was blamed on so-called Asian values and so on and so forth. But actually the crisis was due to the nature of the financialization process which had been taking place before that. But because of the Western-centric mentality of many of our policymakers, we find that they were being influenced by the Western approach. And we find that, for example, the managing director of the IMF, as well as the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, the managing director of the IMF was Michel Camdessus, and of the deputy Treasury Secretary at that time was Larry Summers. And all of them were saying, oh, the problem was a problem of the wrong Asian way of doing things. If you look, a series of speeches, all within a period of a month in January and February 1998, where they all made speeches to this effect. So you find that there are very strong prejudices, that you can learn anything from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, and so on and so forth. These prejudices are part of the problem. And we have to recognize that a lot of it comes from the history of imperialism, the history of colonialism, and so on. Yet another issue, of course, is the whole question of the philosophy of values itself. And we have to recognize that there is a problem of so-called collective action. How do we get society as a whole to be mobilized? And often it is said that, oh, we have in the West, you have so-called a liberal approach, and this is equated with what is called a libertarian approach, where anybody can do that whatever they want, and it doesn't matter what the consequences of those actions. And then the approach which has been adopted in these countries which I referred to are dismissed as totalitarian. And this is part of the ideological debate which is taking place right now. So the very effective approaches in East Asia are dismissed as totalitarian and is not possible in the West. That's why I want to emphasize that in countries in the Republic of Korea, in South Korea, for example, or even in Japan, you find that these countries pride themselves on being very, very independently minded. There's tremendous social mobilization against governments and so on and so forth. but you find that there was an ability for them to work together in the public interest, in the collective interest. And so enabling people to think about what the collective interest is, what the social interest is, by educating them becomes very, very important. When you suppress information, people are not convinced and they become suspicious, and this is what has often happened. And the problem, of course, is worse now because of the availability of social media, and it's so easy to mistrust everything you say, and it's so easy to get confused by a whole variety of misinformation and disinformation which we have. Look, for example, at what has been happening with the so-called lab leak theory. Okay, so you have one type of conspiracy theory that there was the virus actually came from a lab leak in Wuhan Institute of Virology, and this was what basically started the crisis. Then there are alternative conspiracy theories that actually came from some kind of American military facility. All these lab leak theories basically depend on who on a conspiracy theories, and basically it is very unhelpful, because a lot of the world is basically depending on authoritative information. And if you continue to undermine the WHO and say that the WHO, for example, is controlled by China or is controlled by other interests, this is basically undermining confidence in a much more scientific and an approach where there is shared knowledge, where people have learned from each other. The next point I want to make is how the East Asians basically handled the crisis. And I think it's important to recognize that there are a number of very important measures. So finding those who were infected was very, very important. And then tracing their social context is very, very important. Testing to make sure that they were infected and so on. And being able to distinguish those who are severely, who have severe symptoms and those who do not have severe symptoms and which do not need, for example, respiratory machines or ventilator machines. And then able to isolate them in order that they do not continue to spread the virus. In many poor societies, they have just been overwhelmed. They do not have enough facilities in the public hospitals, for example. And what has become necessary is for people to be able to handle them in situ, in wherever the populations live, at home, and so on and so forth. So this has become a very, very important challenge. The fifth element in this find, trace, test, isolate is to treat. And here we have a problem. We have a problem because there is no reliable treatment which everybody is convinced about. And to make things worse, there's a lot of disinformation about treatments. So, for example, some of you might still remember last year, President Trump had his favorite treatment, and so on and so forth. You cannot have, you cannot allow this kind of things to prevail. And so, right now, for example, even treatment, is a question because you do not have 100% efficacy in terms of treatment. And the last element, of course, is support. And this, I think, cannot be underestimated, the need to support. But at the core of this is testing. At the core of it is testing. Because if you do not test, you cannot identify, and you cannot trace the networks, and you cannot effectively contain the contagion which is taking place. So this becomes extremely important. And this is why I think it is important for us to mobilize, especially developing countries, but also the rich countries, need to be mobilized to understand the importance of the initiative taken by South Africa and India in the World Trade Organization. This is an important element because the original resolution is that for the duration of the pandemic, not forever, only for the duration of the pandemic, that the intellectual property rights, and let us remember that intellectual property rights of the World Trade Organization are only about a quarter of a century old. They were only introduced in 1995. It's not as if it is something God-given. So it is important to recognize that TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights, were only introduced in 1995. Before that, there was no international norm. But unfortunately, the TRIPS agreement is one which is heavily biased towards the companies who have so-called intellectual property, usually in the form of patents. Now, what has happened is that they are able to charge pretty much any price, because the whole question of patents, a patent gives a company, because it's usually a company rather than an individual, the right to produce exclusively. It basically is a monopoly right. So very often we think about so-called neoliberalism as being a market. There is no market. This is a monopoly. Okay, and this is very important for us to remember. So this was strengthened, in fact, by an organization claiming to be promoting the market, when in fact it did exactly the opposite, which was basically to preserve monopolies. And the problem, of course, is that much of the research now, is being done by certain big companies who control these intellectual property rights to maximize their profits. And this is a huge problem. So, for example, it is possible to get much of the tests, many of the treatments, and so on and so forth at much lower prices. Even what is called personal protective equipment can be obtained at much lower prices. This, unfortunately, has not become reality. This has not become reality precisely because it is possible for these companies to prevent the use to exercise patents and to prevent others from producing those products, even if they are capable of doing so at much cheaper prices. This is unfortunately a situation which we have in the world today, and for more than 25 years now, it has basically had tremendous adverse effects, especially for public health. So one of the last things the late President Mandela did when he was president of South Africa, because he enjoyed tremendous goodwill after his election as president in 1994, one of the things he did was to fight for the so-called public health exception. Okay, so 1994 he becomes president. 95 TRIPS comes into force. He realizes what is happening because it becomes so expensive to treat people at that time for HIV/AIDS. And so what President Mandela did was to fight for the so-called public health exception. Eventually, after 9/11 in 2001, in order to get the WTO negotiations going again, the rich countries agreed to concede the public health exception. But they wrote the new laws in such a way that it is almost impossible for many developing countries to use the public health exception. And I want to tell you a very ironic story about the rights which are there. Some of you are old enough to remember something called avian flu. It happened about a decade and a half ago. And at the time of avian flu, the flu was actually, unfortunately, started off in Asia also, and it spread to many other parts of the world. Okay, but basically within 3 continental land masses: Asia, Africa, and Europe, which are all interconnected, as you know. It did not spread to America, but at that time, President Bush, George W. Bush, when he got his second term, he had to fire the Secretary of Defense, because the Secretary of Defense played a major role in the Iraq War, and he had to find a scapegoat. So Donald Rumsfeld was fired as Secretary of Defense, and he became the chairman of a company called Halliburton. Okay, a company called Halliburton, which was previously run by the Vice President, Dick Cheney. So what happened was that this company was given the right of compulsory licensing, under compulsory licensing law, to produce Tamiflu. In other words, governments have the right to produce drugs, even when countries have patents. But you need governments who are able to force companies. And most developing countries, most small countries, even in Europe and other small countries, New Zealand and so on, they are not going to be able to stand up to the pressures of the big pharmaceutical companies. So what happened in the case of Tamiflu was this: Tamiflu was produced by 4 American companies, and they produce over 300 million of this thing called Tamiflu. Oh, and the American population is just slightly over 300 million, and at that time. And but none of the birds could fly over either the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. So birds didn't carry the flu virus to the Americas. So there was nobody in America who got infected. So the vaccines which were available in America were never really used. Okay, so billions were used to produce these vaccines, but they were never used. And this was what happened. But the irony, of course, is that poor countries in Asia, in Africa, and so on, who were facing the threat of Tamiflu, avian flu, were not able to have access to vaccines. And a similar situation, unfortunately, is happening now. Okay, let me come back to this question of vaccinations. So you find that the whole question, vaccinations are now the greatest hope, okay, for much of the world. Many people think that we can handle COVID-19 once we can all get vaccinated, or most of the population of the world can get vaccinated. I think it's very important for us to remember that this round of vaccines which are available, okay, are not 100% effective. So the earlier generation of vaccines were 100% effective. And if you think about it, there was, Jonas Salk, the man who developed the polio vaccine. He was once asked, have you patented your vaccine? And his reply was very simple. He said, can you patent the sun? This vaccine belongs to the people. He was not trying to make any money from it. I think this is the spirit of science. This is the spirit of medicine, that you do not try to make money from other people's suffering. But unfortunately, that has been now proceeded by strengthening intellectual property rights. But I think it's very important to remember that these are still possibilities. These are still possibilities. And particularly, I think many people do not realize that there are provisions in US law which allow this to happen. So for example, in the case of the Moderna vaccine was developed largely thanks to President Trump. Okay, President Trump started his thing called Operation Warp Speed, where he financed a number of companies. And the company which first had a breakthrough was Moderna. And Moderna, Moderna has existed for about a decade, but it has never made money. It never, of course, enough to pay salaries and all that, but they have not made big profits. Yeah, and they have been quite successful. Many people from the University of Pennsylvania and MIT were involved in Moderna. So many of them are scientists, and it's a relatively small company, and so on and so forth. So they developed this, and it is possible, if the American government has the political will, to basically say that this was publicly financed, and under something called the Dole Act, of 1980, I think. This can be done. Okay. There are also other laws, which I don't want to get the details. People like Dean Baker, for example, in the US, have written much more extensively about this. The point I'm trying to raise is that if there is the political will, this problem can be overcome. In the case of Pfizer, the so-called Pfizer vaccine is actually not developed by Pfizer. It was developed by a Turkish immigrant family into Germany, and that family has been involved in a lot of research, so on, and they developed, and they have a company called BioNTech, and Pfizer bought over. Okay, Pfizer refused to take money from the US government, but they took money BioNTech took money from the German government. So the German government has different laws, of course, but some laws which allow them to do the same thing. Okay, so and likewise with the so-called AstraZeneca vaccine, which was developed originally by Oxford University, but because these small vaccine developers, some of them are connected to universities and so on and so forth, they do not have the ability to mass produce. They do not have the ability to market, and so on and so forth. So, for example, in my own country, in Malaysia, for example, the two companies which were first to sell their products here were Pfizer. Okay, why? Because they are selling products such as Lipitor for so-called anti-cholesterol drug, plus another drug called Viagra, which is supposed to be for erectile dysfunction. So they already have a presence here. Likewise with AstraZeneca. So these two companies were the first, not because they have superior vaccines or anything like that, but they were the first. So the Chinese vaccines, for example, or the Russian vaccine, Sputnik, in fact, the first company, the first vaccine, and the only vaccine so far to have passed so-called phase 3 trials, okay, is Sputnik. And they completed, and there was a study published about 3 months ago in the British Medical Journal. So they are the only ones who have passed phase 3 trials. So you would expect from a scientific and technical point of view that they will be well ahead. But because of the new Cold War, because of a variety of other factors, Sputnik is nowhere to be seen. It's only in a few countries where they have been able to provide supply the vaccines, not because they are inferior. In fact, they are the most tested vaccines so far, but because of the politics of the situation. So it's very important for us to recognize this. Now, one of the excuses which is often given as to why vaccines cannot be developed in developing countries is that developing countries do not have the capacity. I think it is very important to remember that more than 80 developing countries have already produced vaccines. Now, not all vaccines are the same, and I'm not saying that those countries, with over 80 countries which have produced vaccines are all capable of producing the COVID-19 vaccines. Some of them are, some of them are not. In fact, the mass production of AstraZeneca vaccines is being done by an Indian company called the Serum Institute of India, which is the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world, which is capable of producing hundreds of millions of vaccines within a year, within months. So it is not as if there are no capacities. And when the Indian government was asked how many companies in India who in India is capable of producing this, it came up with a list of more than 10 companies in the case of India. Likewise in Brazil. In Brazil as well, there's a lot of experience with vaccines. The Zika epidemic, which happened a few years ago, was contained, and Brazil has a long history of virological and other related work. So like you can say the same thing about other countries as well, including South Africa and so on. So the question really is that all these are just excuses for not allowing the sharing of technology. Now, I think it's important to recognize the role of the WHO in this regard. Now, some of you know that the WHO includes all countries, right? It includes all countries, and different countries have put pressure on the WHO to do different things. And one of the major initiatives by the WHO is what is called COVAX. Okay, and this was supposed to help middle-income countries to have access to the vaccines. Unfortunately, COVAX has worked basically on market principles. It's almost like an auction. Those who have more money can get those vaccines. So the result is that middle-income countries, even those who are suffering very badly from the pandemic, were not able to get vaccines quickly. Whereas other countries who are just collecting for their own reasons basically were able to. And you have some countries which basically booked not enough for their populations, but actually booked up to 5 times as much as they need for their populations. And Australia were among those countries which did so. In the case of Europe, the overbooking on average, okay, because there are so many countries in the European Union, the overbooking on average was over double, okay, double their needs. So as a result of this, you have a phenomenon of so-called vaccine apartheid, a vaccine apartheid at the international level, where there are countries which were able to get vaccines and some countries which are not able to get vaccines. Now, some of the richer upper middle income countries have been able to get vaccines since then, more recently, because the vaccines for the rich countries have already been delivered. So you have a situation where in some cases, a country which was supposed to get Pfizer had already booked and prepaid a little bit for the Pfizer vaccine, suddenly find that, the manufacturer supplier says, sorry, we're not able to deliver the vaccines in time. And why? Because another country paid much more for the same vaccines. And so they gave it to you. This is how, for example, the Israel paid more than 1.5 times what the US was paying to get its vaccine supply very quickly. So that's how they got they were able to advance very, very quickly. But even then, we find that despite the high rate of vaccination in countries like the UK and Chile, we find that despite that, the situation is still unfortunately out of control. So we cannot think, and the more you delay vaccination at the world level, okay, the more you restrict supply in order to maximize profits, the more that happens, the result, of course, is that there will be not only many people who will be unnecessarily infected and unnecessarily, and some might unnecessarily die, but also very importantly, the virus itself has more time to mutate and more variants and types and so on and so forth can develop. And so so right now, for example, so far we seem to be able to cope with all the variants so far. But if you allow more time for mutations and so on to take place, there is a real possibility that you might have a new variant, a new mutation, which may be beyond the ability of the current range of treatments and vaccines to cope with. So this is a very dangerous thing, because as everybody says, you know, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. You know, this is a very, very major problem. Now, in this situation, we find that that there is a big dilemma. There's a big dilemma for developing countries, and that's why President Biden's offer last month that the US will agree not to have patent enforcement for vaccines, only for vaccines, not for tests, not for personal protective equipment, not for treatment, but for vaccines. What it basically means is you're not giving anything, because right now, under the laws, under TRIPS and so on and so forth, first you register your patent, and only after 18 months, okay, are you able to do you have to register the details of the vaccine, okay, after 18 months. And after those 18 months, okay, that's when that information is available to everybody. But the problem is that you do not have to disclose everything. There are still so-called trade secrets or industrial secrets. And the implication of that is that the information necessary to mass produce the vaccines may not be included, may not be available. And this will further delay this. So in a sense, the TRIPS, the waiver for vaccines is almost irrelevant, because you can imagine, okay, one of the big problems right now with patents is that you have a constant process of evergreening. So you develop let us say you register a patent, but as you develop something, as things develop, new mutations and so on and so forth, you change a little bit the specification of a particular patent. And that is called evergreening. That's why with a lot of technology, a lot of the new technology, the technology continues to be protected, because you have the evergreening by the companies which control technologies, the inability to acquire, to have access to that technology by other means. So the WHO came up with something called CTAP, okay, a technology access platform. And the idea was that people who had the technology would share the technology. Unfortunately, this has not happened. This has not happened because none of the companies have signed up for CTAP. So none of the major companies have signed up for CTAP. And so the result is that you're not able to share the necessary information which is necessary to make progress. This is the big problem. So, which then leads me to another major problem, and that is the interest of the big pharmaceutical companies. And I want to use the case of Pfizer, because the CEO of Pfizer, a man named Alberto Burla. Alberto Burla has announced that Pfizer now considers C19 endemic. What is the implication of that? They basically believe that the world will be living with C19, with COVID-19 for some time to come. Okay, so if COVID-19 is part of our lives for the foreseeable future, what does that mean? It basically means two things: that Pfizer new medium-term business strategy is basically they do not expect a huge income flow from Lipitor, the cholesterol drug. They're no longer counting on a big income flow from even Viagra, but rather they are expecting COVID-19 to become their cash cow. And so they are buying up companies which produce everything connected with COVID-19, including the tests, including producing, the companies which own the equipment, personal protective equipment, which are own the patents for producing the personal protective equipment, and so on and so forth. So this is the strategy. So what does that imply? It implies that for the big pharmaceutical companies, they have no interest in ending the pandemic, because this is going to be their source of income for some time to come. And this is a very, very dangerous situation. We have a business and a number of businesses which depend on the continuation of this pandemic for their profits. And this is a situation which we're going to live with. So they expect, for example, that every now and then with some new variant or mutation and so on and so forth, they are going to be producing new booster shots. So sometimes, now in the West, for example, every year during before winter, they will ask you to have a new booster shot for the forthcoming flu season. But now what we are going to see is that you're going to need booster shots, not for the flu season, but for the new mutation or variant of SARS-CoV-2, the virus. So this becomes a huge problem. This becomes a huge problem when you have business interests which want the problem to survive. They want the problem to continue. Now, the next issue I want to raise is the whole question of the new Cold War. We have a situation now in the world, as we know, it's no secret that there is, on the one hand, you have NATO and you have the so-called Quad. Okay, for other parts of the world may not know what the Quad is, but it's basically a pro-US alliance involving Japan, Australia, India, and yeah. So you basically, those are the four countries in the Quad. Okay, so they are complement in a sense NATO, and they have basically declared that they see the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, as their opposition. So, for example, you find that the United Kingdom, okay, which recently built 2 aircraft carriers. One aircraft carrier is in Europe. The other aircraft carrier was sent to Southeast Asia, to the South China Sea. Okay, when Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, was considering different options to have Donald Trump lead a limited war effort last year, he tried to mobilize some Southeast Asian countries to have a little conflict with China, and where they would come in and participate in joint military operations with their so-called allies in this region. So this is a very, very dangerous situation. Now, a Cold War can also have some so-called beneficial effects. I want to give you an example from public health. In the 1970s, in the late 1970s, I think it was, the Soviet Union at that time challenged the US to let us eradicate smallpox from the world within a decade. And Jimmy Carter, I think, who was the president at that time, accepted the challenge. And within a decade, smallpox was history as far as the people of the world were concerned. So you can have desirable outcomes, But unfortunately, the current situation is a very, very dangerous situation. So our understanding of COVID-19, our understanding of the virus and so on and so forth, is all being frustrated by the lack of international cooperation. When the WHO's study team did not say that the virus came from a laboratory leak from Wuhan virology lab, what did the Secretary of State of the US say, Anthony Blinken? He said, no, they're not happy with that result, with that finding, and they want another study, to ascertain that. So what we find is that, public health, the welfare of people of the world is being tied up with this new Cold War in a very, very dangerous way. I want to come to two more issues because I think they are very important for us to consider. And a lot of it has to do with financing. Both issues have to do with financing. The first issue is the issue of the special drawing rights, which the IMF has issued. Okay, so the IMF, as most people know, is a very biased institution. It is not one country, one vote, or one person, one vote. Rather, it is $1, one vote, crudely speaking. But it was frozen in time about 3 decades or 4 decades ago. So we find that since, let us say, the 1980s, many economies, especially in East Asia, but also countries like India and so on, have grown very fast. But their shares, their voting rights have not changed correspondingly. So they have increased, but not to reflect the relative size of the Chinese economy or the Indian economy and so on. So, but in any case, the voting rights have to do with the special drawing rights. So when it was agreed, when it first came, the proposal first came up to the IMF, the Trump administration opposed the issue of new SDRs, but Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, agreed to them. But the only way to get them without going to the houses of Congress is to there is a limit. So she basically agreed to about 650 billion new SDRs, and that 650 billion is about 500 billion special drawing rights. So that was the agreement which was made some time ago, and it will soon be implemented. Now, the special drawing rights basically help countries in 2 ways. Okay, it gives them the right basically to spend more while you create a greater liquidity through the special drawing rights. Now, in the case of this particular special drawing right, so the pool get these rights. The rights will go according to how big your economy is. So most poor countries will hardly get anything. Okay, but even the rich countries which get it are not going to use the special drawing rights they have. Many European countries, for example, are not going to use the special drawing rights. Even Japan may not use much of their special drawing rights, even though Japan owes more than double their annual GDP. They are not going to use it because special drawing rights are only useful for countries which need to spend for imports. You don't need it or to pay debt. You don't need it otherwise. So what some of us have been proposing is that these special drawing rights, which are unused by the rich countries, go into the pool, and they can be issued to about 15 designated international financial institutions, and they can choose who to give it to. So, for example, I was working with some financial authorities in Africa, and the proposal is that the special drawing rights should be made available to the African Development Bank, and the African Development Bank can then use it to increase its own capacity to lend to members. Now, this is very important because it then makes it possible to increase the amount of lending to African countries. Because what has happened after the last 4 decades of reforms of so-called globalization and economic liberalization is that more and more economies in the South, because of trade liberalization and so on, are much more externally oriented. And they often need to be able to import, especially if their own production chains, the supply chains have been disrupted. So this becomes very important. So it is very important to make that kind of fiscal expansion possible. So that's one thing as far as that is concerned. But the second thing, which is also related, is for developing countries to realize that if they are spending, if they need to spend for domestic users, yeah, not to import stuff from abroad, they can actually issue debt. Okay, developing countries can issue debt. If you look at what has happened in the rich countries now, most of them are spending a lot, okay, but they are borrowing internally. They are not going to international markets to borrow because they don't need foreign exchange. They are spending domestically. So if you issue internal debt, there are no constraints, and the credit rating agencies can't bully you and so on and so forth. So it's very important for developing countries, including the poorer developing countries, to realize that they have much more space. They have much more fiscal space than they realize. And this is something I think that the organizations such as the International Monetary Fund should be advising governments, including governments of poor countries. So my last point, I think, is basically that we have to recognize that the situation before this crisis was not a wonderful situation. So I reject the slogan of certain people who want to build back better. No, we don't want to build back better. The situation before was not wonderful. What we want to do is to build forward better. And this is very important. So we need to think about building forward better in terms of 3 things: in terms of relief, in terms of recovery, in terms of reform. And this is extremely important for us to bring into the discussion today, because when you're thinking about policies, if we do not ensure relief, and in developing countries, generally speaking, we have very small formal sectors, much bigger informal sectors, and so the impact, many of them will not benefit, for example, from measures which might be helpful in rich countries, such as wage, informal, those workers who are paid on a daily basis. If they cannot work because of stay-in-shelter lockdowns, they have no income. If they have no income, they do not spend. If they do not spend, there is no demand for the goods which are produced in the economy. And slowly, what has begun as a temporary recession, or a potentially temporary, can drag out and become a depression. So this is a huge danger for developing countries. And already we are seeing inequalities growing, not only domestically within many economies, but very, very importantly, the gap between rich countries and poor countries is growing once again. And the ability or otherwise to spend, the fiscal measures which I was talking about, recommending earlier, becomes very, very crucial. Developing countries cannot be handicapped by their own mentalities of thinking that they are not able to do more because of so-called credit markets and financial markets. They have to be bolder in order to finance relief, to ensure that the most vulnerable are at least protected, okay? And to try to ensure enough liquidity and to ensure that there is enough for recovery. You cannot just think that when the lockdown is over, you can turn on the economy and things will go back to normal. That is not the way economies work. You need to keep the economy ticking. And this is why relief has to be thought of, not just in terms of relief, but how essential it is for recovery. And this is, I think, very important. But also, and nobody is talking, not many people are talking about this, what kinds of reform measures are we going to introduce? What kinds of things should be emphasized? What needs to be combined? For over 1 billion people in the world, they do not have electricity. Are we going to deny them electricity because you want to have carbon pricing and so on and so forth? Or are we going to enable them to move very quickly to renewable forms of energy through photovoltaic solar panels, for example, or through wind turbines and other measures, whatever is appropriate in different conditions. These are the options which need to be thought about, and therefore it is important for us to maximize the fiscal space available in order to finance relief, recovery, and reform measures. And only through such an approach can we ensure that this contagion, which is already becoming a catastrophe, does not lead us into a depression which will last for decades. Just remember that what happened at the beginning of the 1930s lasted a decade in the US, and the US had much more policy tools, and President Roosevelt was trying his best. It was only after the US went into World War II that the economy really got going again, and we know the different effects of it. Not recommending war by any means, but I think it is very important for us to recognize that the danger of what has started off as a temporary recession dragging out and becoming a depression. So let me stop here now. I'm sorry I went over. I promised to stop after an hour, but I hope that this has been useful and we can have a discussion and a debate over the next hour. Thank you very much for your attention.